Before we begin, please be advised that this story explores themes of historical mystery, unexplained phenomena, and psychological suspense. Listener discretion is advised. The quiet hum of the fluorescent lights was usually the loudest sound in Daniel Miller's world. For 12 years, Daniel, a meticulous historian and archivist at the Gettysburg National Military Park, had found solace in the verifiable. His life was a carefully constructed fortress of facts, dates, and documented truths. He thrived in the hushed sanctity of the park's research facility, surrounded by brittle maps, yellowed letters, and the weight of history meticulously preserved. Every artifact, every diary entry, every faded photograph told a story, a chapter in the epic narrative of a nation scarred and reborn. Daniel knew these stories intimately, had cataloged them, cross-referenced them, lived and breathed them until the faint scent of old paper and dust felt like home. His current project, a comprehensive digital archive of privately donated battlefield maps, was a testament to his dedication. It was painstaking work, comparing hand-drawn sketches from forgotten veterans with official survey maps, identifying discrepancies, noting terrain features that had long since vanished. He found a peculiar comfort in its methodical rhythm, a predictable flow of information that rarely surprised him, until it did. It was a Tuesday afternoon, a day like any other, the autumn sun casting long shadows through the tall windows of the archive. Daniel was hunched over a large oak table, a magnifying glass clutched in his hand, scrutinizing a map donated by the descendants of a local physician, Dr. Alastair Finch. The map itself was a rarity, a detailed topographical rendering of the battlefield's western flank, sketched with an almost artistic precision, showing subtle contours and long-gone farm tracks. He was plotting troop movements for July 1, 1863, specifically the Union I Corps' desperate stand. His finger traced the lines of McPherson Ridge, then slid north towards the Chambersburg Pike. That's when he saw it. A small, almost imperceptible notation, penned in faded sepia ink, nestled in a patch of woods just south of the Pike, an area known today as Herbst Woods. It wasn't a familiar unit designation. Instead, scrawled beneath a crude sketch of a small encampment, were the words, 13th Pay Volume Provisional Reg. Daniel paused, his magnifying glass hovering. 13th Pennsylvania Volunteer Provisional Regiment. The name echoed strangely in his mind. He knew every Union regiment that fought at Gettysburg, had memorized their numbers, their commanders, their positions. He certainly knew every Pennsylvania regiment. There was no 13th Pennsylvania Volunteer Provisional Regiment listed among them. The 13th Pennsylvania Reserves, yes, the Bucktails, a celebrated unit. But a provisional regiment? No, definitely not. He dismissed it as a cartographer's error, perhaps a mislabeling, or a unit that was never officially formed, yet somehow found its way onto a doctor's personal map. It was a minor anomaly, easily overlooked by anyone less obsessed with historical purity. But Daniel was Daniel. He couldn't simply overlook it. His internal database, a vast mental library of Civil War minutiae, flagged it as an inconsistency. He opened his digital archive, cross-referencing every known Union regiment present at Gettysburg. He checked the official records of the War of the Rebellion, scanned regimental histories, scoured the compiled service records. Nothing. The 13th Pennsylvania Volunteer Provisional Regiment simply did not exist. It wasn't a temporary detachment, wasn't a militia unit, wasn't a clerical error in the official rolls. It was a blank, a void. A prickle of professional curiosity, sharp and insistent, began to nag at him. He pulled out the thick volumes of Pennsylvania's Civil War rosters, running his finger down the lists of regiments, company by company. The 13th Pennsylvania Volunteers existed, yes, but it was known as the 1st Pennsylvania Reserves and had already seen significant action before Gettysburg, serving in the Peninsula Campaign and at 2nd Manassas. It was not a provisional regiment at Gettysburg, nor was it positioned anywhere near Herbst Woods on July 1st. And there was no record of any 13th PA Volume Provisional Reg anywhere in the official annals. The more he searched, the more the absence became a presence. It was like looking for a star in a familiar constellation and finding only empty space where it should be. Yet the map clearly depicted it. This wasn't just a missing detail. It was a deliberate erasure, or a monumental oversight. Neither sat well with Daniel. His fortress of facts was beginning to show a crack. He looked back at Dr. Finch's map. The handwriting was careful, precise, not the hurried scrawl of a man making a mistake. The ink was the same shade of sepia as the surrounding terrain details, suggesting it was original to the map, not a later addition. Daniel felt a strange pull, a whisper from the past that defied the silence of the archives. He spent the rest of the afternoon and then the next morning digging deeper. He checked newspaper archives from Carlisle and Harrisburg, looking for any mention, however obscure, of such a unit. He examined contemporary civilian accounts, local histories, even obscure battlefield guides from the late 19th century. Nothing. The 13th PA volume provisional reg was a phantom, existing only on Dr. Finch's map. The sheer meticulousness of the map itself, the intricate details of stream beds and rock formations that aligned perfectly with modern surveys, made it difficult to dismiss the notation as a simple fabrication. Dr. Finch was a respected local figure, a physician who had volunteered on the battlefield, tending to the wounded. His accounts were generally regarded as highly reliable. Why would he invent a regiment? The question gnawed at Daniel. It wasn't a matter of historical debate. It was a fundamental contradiction of known history. He felt a profound unease, a sense that something vital had been deliberately excised from the record. Driven by an impulse that bordered on obsession, Daniel decided to visit the location marked on the map. It was a clear, crisp October afternoon when he drove his sensible sedan through the quiet roads of the battlefield. Herbst Woods, not far from the Eternal Light Peace Memorial, was a relatively secluded area, less frequented by tourists than the main avenues of monuments. He parked near a small pull-off and began to walk, consulting a digital overlay of Dr. Finch's map on his tablet. The woods were silent, save for the rustle of fallen leaves underfoot. The air was cool, carrying the scent of damp earth and decaying foliage. He navigated through the sparse trees, past moss-covered rocks and gnarled roots, until he reached the approximate coordinates marked on the old map. There was nothing remarkable about the spot, just a quiet clearing, a slight depression in the ground that might have once been a shallow trench or a fire pit. He stood there for a long time, scanning the ground, feeling foolish yet compelled. He ran his fingers through the leaf litter, imagining the long-gone encampment. What was he hoping to find? A forgotten tent peg? A buried canteen? The idea was absurd. The ground had been scoured by relic hunters for generations. But then, as he was about to turn back, his gaze caught something glinting faintly beneath a thick tangle of roots from an ancient oak. It was small, metallic, partially obscured by soil and decades of organic debris. Daniel knelt, carefully brushing away the dirt, his heart beginning to beat a little faster. What he unearthed was a military button. It wasn't a standard Union Eagle button, nor a Confederate I or A button. This was different. Slightly larger, made of a dark aged bronze, its face bore a distinctive, unfamiliar insignia. A stylized bare oak tree, its branches reaching upwards, encircled by a wreath of laurel. The back was smooth, without any manufacturer's mark. He held it in his palm, feeling its unexpected weight. The design was unique, unlike anything he had ever seen in his extensive study of Civil War uniforms. He pulled out his tablet, comparing the oak tree insignia to the faint, almost indiscernible sketch on Dr. Finch's map, which had depicted a small, almost heraldic symbol next to the regimental notation. The match was undeniable. The oak tree, a chill far colder than the autumn air, traced its way down Daniel's spine. This wasn't a mislabeling. This wasn't a fabrication. This was physical evidence, tangible and undeniable, of a unit that history had somehow swallowed whole. The 13th Pennsylvania Volunteer Provisional Regiment was not just a name on a map. It had been real, or at least something had been real enough to leave this behind. And if it was real, why was there no record? Why was it so thoroughly erased? The silence of the historical record suddenly felt less like absence, and more like a deliberate, terrifying hush. The silence of the historical record suddenly felt less like absence, and more like a deliberate, terrifying hush. Michael felt it acutely now, a cold, creeping dread that had nothing to do with ghosts and everything to do with the living. He traced the outline of the strange uniform button he'd found. It was brass, or at least it looked like brass, but its weight felt off, heavier, and the metal itself held a peculiar, almost iridescent sheen under the lamplight. The insignia etched into its surface was a stylized eagle, wings spread wide, but it wasn't any eagle he recognized from Union or Confederate regiments. It wasn't even a state militia emblem. It was entirely alien, yet undeniably military. This wasn't a prop, not a modern fake. The patina, the erosion, it was all authentic. He spent the next few days in a blur of frantic research. He scoured every online database imaginable. Civil War regimental histories, uniform guides, obscure collectors' forums, even forensic metallurgy sites, hoping to find a match for the button's unusual composition or its cryptic insignia. He cross-referenced every known unit that fought at Gettysburg, every company, every independent battalion, searching for any anomaly, any mention of a unit that didn't quite fit. He found nothing. Absolutely nothing. It was as if this button, this physical, tangible piece of history, simply did not exist within the documented past. The more he searched, the more the digital world, usually so eager to offer answers, seemed to mock him with its blank stares. The frustration gnawed at him, but beneath it, a new resolve hardened. If the answers weren't in the easily accessible records, they had to be in the hidden ones. He packed a bag, the strange button carefully secured in a velvet pouch, and drove back to Pennsylvania. His first stop, a small, unassuming historical society nestled in a quiet town just outside Gettysburg. It was known for its meticulous, if somewhat antiquated, collection of local Civil War artifacts and personal correspondences. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of old paper and dust. He was directed to a young archivist named Sarah Miller. Sarah was bright, with sharp, intelligent eyes that peered over the top of her glasses, and a no-nonsense demeanor that suggested she'd heard every eccentric theory under the sun. "Another ghost story, perhaps?" she asked, a polite but weary smile playing on her lips, as Michael explained his predicament, carefully omitting the more inexplicable details of his discovery. He simply presented the button and his inability to identify it. Sarah took the button, her brow furrowing slightly as her fingers brushed the cold metal. She pulled out a magnifying glass and examined it closely, turning it over and over. This is unusual," she murmured, her initial skepticism giving way to genuine curiosity. "The design, it's not standard issue for either side. Not even a known militia or independent company. And the metal," she tapped it lightly with a fingernail, "feels different, almost too dense." She spent the next hour with Michael, pulling out heavy leather-bound tomes, old photograph albums, and even a tray of various Civil War-era buttons. She compared it to everything they had, cross-referencing against detailed diagrams and historical accounts. Each comparison only deepened the mystery. The button was an outlier, a historical anomaly. "I've never seen anything like it," Sarah admitted, pushing her glasses up her nose. "And trust me, I've cataloged thousands of items. This should be easily identifiable." She paused, her gaze distant for a moment. "There are whispers, of course. Old local legends. Tales of a lost company. Soldiers who appeared and vanished like mist on the battlefield. Most historians dismiss it as folklore, the romanticized grief of a generation. But to find something tangible..." She looked at Michael, her expression now serious. "This changes things." Michael felt a surge of hope, a confirmation that he wasn't entirely mad. "You've heard these stories?" "Bits and pieces," she replied. "Usually from older residents, farmers whose families have been here for generations. They talk about a unit that fought with an almost unnatural ferocity, then was simply no longer there, leaving no wounded, no dead, no official record. Like they were erased. It's always dismissed as a collective hallucination, mass hysteria from the trauma of war. But this button," Michael insisted, "it's real." Sarah nodded slowly. "It is. And it shouldn't exist. There are some uncatalogued archives in the basement. Old personal effects donated over the decades that haven't been properly sorted. Sometimes we find oddities down there. Things deemed too strange or too unidentifiable for public display. It's a long shot, but if anyone else encountered something like this, it might be tucked away in one of those boxes." They descended into the coolness of the basement, a labyrinth of metal shelves stacked high with dusty boxes. The air was heavy still, and the silence felt different down here, less peaceful, more watchful. As they began to pull boxes, searching through brittle newspapers and faded letters, Michael felt an unsettling prickle on the back of his neck. It was a familiar sensation, the feeling of being observed but amplified. He dismissed it as nerves, attributed it to the spooky atmosphere of the old archives. For hours they sifted through forgotten histories. They found fascinating tidbits, poignant letters, and even some grisly battlefield relics. but nothing that resembled Michael's button or the Phantom Regiment Sarah had mentioned. Just as Michael was starting to lose hope, Sarah let out a small gasp. She held up a small leather-bound journal, its cover cracked and worn. "Look at this," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "It's an officer's journal, Major Thomas Reed." He was a Union officer, known for his meticulous record-keeping. But this section is heavily redacted, and the handwriting changes. Michael leaned closer. The journal entries for a specific week in July 1863, right around the time of the battle, were almost entirely blacked out. But beneath the thick ink, in a different hurried script, a few words were visible. "East, the company that came from nowhere, vanished as quickly. The symbol of the raven. They were not men, not truly. The secret must die with us." The words sent a chill down Michael's spine. "The raven," he repeated, looking at his button. The stylized eagle on his button, on closer inspection, could almost be interpreted as a raven, its head slightly tilted, its body sleek and dark. Suddenly, a loud crash echoed from upstairs, followed by the distinct sound of breaking glass. Sarah and Michael froze, their hearts hammering in their chests. "Hello," Sarah called out, her voice trembling. "Is anyone there?" Silence. Only the faint creak of the old building settling. "Stay here," Michael urged, grabbing a heavy iron paperweight. He started cautiously up the creaking wooden stairs, his senses on high alert. The main hall, which had been empty when they came down, was now a mess. A display case holding antique firearms had been shattered, and several rifles lay scattered on the floor. It looked like a robbery, but nothing appeared to be missing. The rifles were still there, untouched. It was an act of vandalism, of intimidation. Sarah, now beside him, gasped, pointing to a small dark feather lying on the polished wooden floor, right beside the shattered case. It was a raven's feather. "Who would do this?" she whispered, her eyes wide with fear. Nothing was taken. Michael picked up the feather, its black surface impossibly smooth. "Someone doesn't want us looking into Major Reed's journal. Someone doesn't want us asking about the company that came from nowhere." He looked at the feather, then at the button in his pocket, then at Sarah. "This isn't just about a lost regiment, Sarah. This is about a secret. And someone is actively trying to keep it buried." The silence that followed was no longer just an absence of sound. It was a hungry, watchful presence. The historical record wasn't merely silent. It was actively fighting back. They had disturbed something ancient and malevolent, something that had been meticulously erased from history, and now it was stirring. The Phantom Regiment wasn't just a legend anymore. It felt like a threat, and Michael and Sarah, armed with a strange button and a redacted journal, had just painted targets on their backs. The weight of those words hung heavy in the air. A chilling prophecy whispered in the quiet of Michael's study. Targets on their backs. It wasn't hyperbole. The journal, with its ominous redactions, and the strange, cold button in Sarah's palm, felt less like historical artifacts and more like pieces of a trap, freshly sprung. "This is insane," Sarah breathed, her voice barely a whisper, the button clinking softly as she set it on the polished mahogany desk. Its surface, a dull brass, bore an intricate, almost alien insignia. A coiled serpent entwined around a shattered sword, all beneath a constellation of 7 stars. It was unlike any Civil War-era military button Michael had ever seen, and his collection was extensive. The craftsmanship was too precise, too unique for standard issue. It radiated an ancient, almost ceremonial aura. Michael, meanwhile, was already poring over the journal again, his fingers tracing the thick black lines that obliterated so much of the text. Insane, maybe, but someone went to a lot of trouble to keep this secret. And now we know a piece of it. He flipped through pages, his eyes scanning for any tiny detail missed. The ink was old, faded, but the redactions were strikingly fresh, glossy black against the sepia-toned paper. It was as if someone had gone through it recently, not decades ago. Sarah meticulously examined the button, even attempting to gently clean a tiny speck of grime. But the insignia remained enigmatic, refusing to yield its secrets. "This symbol isn't in any Civil War unit database," she murmured, a growing unease settling in her stomach. "It feels secret." The journal, however, began to offer tantalizing slivers of information. Michael discovered a faint watermark on one page, a small, almost imperceptible P intertwined with an R, barely visible unless held at a specific angle to the light. "PR," he murmured. Phantom Regiment? He then noticed something else. On heavily redacted pages, the black ink was so thick it had to bleed through. He carefully turned a page, holding it against the light, looking at the reverse side. And there, faintly like a ghostly echo, he saw it. Not the text itself, but the impressions of the words pressed into the paper by the original writer, before the redactions. It was like reading a mirror image of an erased memory. "Sarah, look at this!" he exclaimed, his voice tight with excitement and a touch of dread. "It's not the ink, it's the indentations. The original writing." Sarah leaned in, her eyes widening. The faint, almost invisible grooves. With painstaking care, they began to decipher the ghostly script. It was agony, a slow, frustrating process, but gradually fragmented words began to emerge. Was ordered to silence. The incident at Devil's Den. Not a retreat, but a cleansing. They vanish into the mist. The general knows. The serpent's eye watches. The tunnels beneath the farm. The pact was sealed in blood. No survivors allowed to speak. The truth buried deeper than the fallen. Their purpose to ensure the secret dies with them. Each fragment was a hammer blow, each phrase a chilling confirmation. Silence, cleansing tunnels, sealed in blood. Sarah whispered, her face pale. This isn't just about a lost unit. This is about something horrific, a massacre disguised as a disappearance. A conspiracy. The casual brutality of no survivors allowed to speak sent a shiver through her. The phrase "the serpent's eye watches" sent a jolt through Michael, instantly linking back to the coiled serpent on the button. It wasn't just an insignia. It was a warning, a symbol of surveillance, a watchful ancient malevolence. The mention of tunnels beneath the farm hinted at a hidden physical location, perhaps where the cleansing occurred. This wasn't just a ghost story. It was a meticulously orchestrated cover-up, a conspiracy spanning generations. As the night wore on, the air in the study grew colder, the shadows longer. They were so engrossed, so consumed by the spectral clues, that they almost missed it. A faint, almost imperceptible scent wafting through the open window. It was subtle, metallic, and distinctly out of place in Michael's quiet suburban home. Copper, maybe? Or something fouler like old blood, but mixed with something industrial. A faint hint of ozone, like the air after a high-voltage electrical discharge. Michael, accustomed to the familiar smells of his house, was the first to notice. He paused, inhaling deeply, his brow furrowed in confusion. "Do you smell that?" he asked, his voice low, a tremor of unease rippling through him. Sarah sniffed the air, her expression shifting from focused concentration to alarm. "Yeah, what is that? It's definitely metallic. And that ozone smell, almost like a battery burning." They both looked towards the window, which faced the backyard. The moon was high, casting long, eerie shadows. There was nothing visible, no movement. But the scent was undeniable now, stronger, sharper. A cold, chemical tang that seemed to cling to the very air. An unwelcome intruder. He reached for the window latch, intending to close it, when his fingers brushed against something cold and smooth on the sill. He pulled his hand back instinctively, then looked closer. There, resting on the wooden sill, nestled against the frame, was a single small black feather. It was unlike any bird feather he'd ever seen, sleek, almost synthetic in its texture, with an unnatural stiffness. Its surface was obsidian black, but tipped with a faint iridescent sheen that seemed to glow faintly, almost imperceptibly, in the moonlight like polished oil. "What is that?" Sarah asked, rising and coming to stand beside him, her voice barely above a whisper, her eyes wide. Michael picked up the feather between his thumb and forefinger. It was surprisingly light, yet felt unnaturally dense. "I don't know," he murmured, his voice tight. "It's not from any bird around here. It's too perfect, too dark." He turned it over. There was a tiny, almost microscopic indentation on the shaft, near the quill. A minute, almost invisible etching of a coiled serpent, identical to the one on the brass button, but far more subtly rendered. A chill that had nothing to do with the night air snaked its way down Michael's spine. This wasn't a random occurrence. This was a message. A calling card. Someone had been there, at their window, while they were consumed by the secrets of the journal. Someone had left this. A deliberate, chilling statement. "The scent," Sarah murmured, her eyes fixed on the feather, a dawning horror in her expression. "It's gone now, mostly dissipated. But it was definitely here. And this feather, This wasn't here 5 minutes ago. Michael knew. He knew with a cold certainty that permeated every fiber of his being. They hadn't just painted targets on their backs. Someone had already taken aim. The Phantom Regiment, or whatever shadowy entity stood behind its legend, was terrifyingly real. And it was watching them. Not from the distant past, but from the present, from the very darkness outside their window, from the edges of their own home. The silence in the study became oppressive, no longer peaceful but charged with a palpable, suffocating tension. The button, the journal, and now the strange, sinister feather. They were pieces of a puzzle Michael and Sarah had inadvertently started to solve. But the picture forming was terrifying beyond anything they could have imagined. It wasn't just a historical mystery. It was a contemporary threat, a silent, unseen force that had just breached the sanctity of their home, leaving behind a chilling signature. They exchanged a look, a shared understanding of the terrifying gravity of their situation. Fear was a cold hand gripping their hearts, squeezing the breath from their lungs, but beneath it, a flicker of something else ignited. A stubborn resolve, a defiant spark. They had stumbled into something far bigger than they could have ever conceived. A conspiracy that had meticulously buried its secrets for over a century. A conspiracy now actively defending itself with a chilling precision. And they, two ordinary people, were now caught directly in its crosshairs, unwilling participants in a deadly game. The game had just begun, and they were terrifyingly playing for their lives. The Phantom wasn't just a ghost. It was a hunter, and Michael and Sarah were its prey. Trapped in a nightmare that had just become horrifyingly real. The Phantom wasn't just a ghost. It was a hunter, and Michael and Sarah were its prey. Trapped in a nightmare that had just become horrifyingly real. Panic, cold and sharp, seized them. Michael didn't hesitate. He grabbed Sarah's hand, pulling her through the oppressive darkness, away from the unseen terror that had revealed its sinister intent. Their feet pounded against the uneven ground, twigs snapping underfoot, leaves rustling like mocking whispers in their wake. Every shadow seemed to stretch, to writhe, to coalesce into the form of a soldier, a skeletal hand reaching out. The air grew heavy, thick with the scent of damp earth and something metallic, something like old blood. They didn't know where they were running, only that they had to get away. The familiar landmarks of the battlefield, once a source of historical wonder, now twisted into grotesque, menacing shapes. The monuments stood like silent, stone sentinels watching their desperate flight. The cannons, once symbols of past conflict, now seemed aimed directly at them, their dark muzzles gaping like hungry mouths. Sarah stumbled, a choked cry escaping her lips, but Michael hauled her upright, his grip iron-strong. His heart hammered against his ribs, a frantic drumbeat of terror. He could feel the Phantom's presence, not just behind them, but all around them, a chilling awareness that permeated the very air. It was a suffocating pressure, a cold dread that seeped into their bones. This wasn't just a haunting, it was a pursuit. They burst through a sparse line of trees, gasping for breath, their lungs burning. In the distance, a faint glow promised civilization, the lights of the visitor center, a beacon of sanity in their unraveling world. Michael dragged Sarah towards their rental car, parked haphazardly in the near-empty lot. Hope surged, a fragile, desperate thing. If they could just get to the car, if they could just drive away, put miles between them and this cursed place, maybe they could wake up from this nightmare. Fumbling with shaking hands, Michael found the keys in his pocket. He jammed the key into the lock, the click echoing unnaturally loud in the silence. They scrambled inside, locking the doors with a clunk that offered little comfort. Sarah immediately leaned over, trying to catch her breath, her chest heaving. Her eyes, wide and terrified, darted around the car, as if expecting the Phantom to materialize in the back seat. "It's okay, we're in," Michael whispered, more to convince himself than her. He inserted the key into the ignition, his fingers trembling. He turned it. Nothing. He tried again. The engine coughed once, a weak, pathetic sound, then died. No lights on the dashboard. No hum of the electronics. The car was dead. Completely, utterly dead. A cold dread, far worse than the panic of moments before, washed over them. They were trapped. Here. In Gettysburg. With it. Sarah whimpered, a small broken sound. No. No, no, no. Michael slammed his fist against the steering wheel. A wave of frustrated despair washing over him. Damn it. What the hell is going on? He tried the radio, the headlights, the power windows. Nothing. The car was a metal coffin. An inert shell in the middle of a haunted battlefield. Then a flicker. On the passenger seat where Sarah had tossed her bag, something glinted. It wasn't hers. It was an old, tarnished silver locket, intricately carved with a faded, almost indistinguishable crest. Michael picked it up, his brow furrowed. It felt ancient, heavy with history. He hadn't seen it before. Neither had Sarah. Where did this come from? Sarah whispered, her voice barely audible. Michael opened the locket. Inside, 2 miniature sepia-tone photographs. One was a stern-faced officer with piercing eyes and a neatly trimmed beard. The other a beautiful young woman with a gentle smile, her hair pulled back in a Victorian style. But it wasn't the faces that made Michael's blood run cold. It was the inscription etched on the inside of the locket, so faint it was almost invisible. Asterisk for my beloved Eliza. From Captain Nathaniel Stone, July 1, 1863. Asterisk. July 1, 1863. The first day of the Battle of Gettysburg. Captain Nathaniel Stone. The name echoed in Michael's mind, a name he felt he should know but couldn't place. And the crest, he'd seen it before, hadn't he? It was distinct, a coiled serpent around a broken sword. He'd seen it on a small, obscure historical marker near McPherson Ridge, one that mentioned a specific, ill-fated Union regiment. The 11th Pennsylvania, if he remembered correctly. But why was this locket here in their car? A new terrifying thought solidified in Michael's mind. The Phantom wasn't just haunting the battlefield. It was hunting them. And it was leaving clues, playing a twisted game. This locket, this name, this date, it was a message. It's not just a ghost, Sarah said, her voice shaking. It's intelligent. It knows who we are. It knows we're trying to leave. It wants us to stay, Michael finished, his gaze fixed on the locket. It wants us to understand. The silence in the car became unbearable, pressing in on them. Michael checked his phone. No signal. Sarah's phone too was dead. They were completely cut off. Isolated. We have to get out of the car, Sarah said suddenly, her voice laced with a newfound resolve born of desperation. It's not safe here. It's too exposed. Michael nodded, agreeing. Remaining in the dead car felt like waiting for a predator to circle its prey. But where do we go? We can't just wander aimlessly in the dark. Back to the visitor center? Sarah suggested, though the hope in her voice was thin. There might be someone there, a ranger, security. It was their only option. With a shared terrified glance, they opened the doors and stepped back out into the chilling night. The air felt even colder now, the shadows deeper, more menacing. As they started walking, their footsteps muffled by the grass, Michael felt a subtle shift in the atmosphere. The suffocating dread was still there, but now it was accompanied by a strange, insistent pull, a quiet whisper in his mind, urging him in a specific direction. It wasn't towards the visitor center. It was deeper into the battlefield, towards the western edge, towards McPherson Ridge. Do you feel that? Sarah whispered, clutching his arm. It's like it's calling us. I do, Michael admitted, his voice hoarse. Towards McPherson Ridge. As if in response, a faint, almost imperceptible sound drifted on the wind. It was distant, ethereal, yet distinctly human. A mournful bugle call. A melody of despair and farewell. It was the sound of taps, played on an ancient instrument, imbued with the sorrow of a lost century. It wasn't coming from the visitor center. It was coming from the direction of McPherson Ridge. Michael looked at the locket in his hand. Captain Nathaniel Stone, July 1, 1863. McPherson Ridge. The 11th Pennsylvania. It was all aligning. The Phantom wasn't just a random spirit. It was tied to something specific, something tragic, something that happened on that very ground. They had a choice. Try to fight the unseen force pulling them or follow it. But fighting it hadn't worked so far. Running had only led them to a dead car and deeper into the Phantom's game. Maybe, just maybe, understanding was their only way out. If this Phantom was leaving clues, if it wanted them to know something, perhaps giving in to its pull for now was their only path to survival. They had to play its game, but on their terms if possible. They had to uncover the truth of Captain Nathaniel Stone and the Phantom Regiment. With a heavy heart and a knot of icy fear in his stomach, Michael turned, guiding Sarah away from the distant lights of safety, deeper into the historical darkness. They walked towards the chilling bugle call, towards the heart of the mystery, towards McPherson Ridge. Every step felt like an act of surrender, a descent into the unknown. The Phantom had drawn them into its web, and now they were following the thread, hoping it led to answers, not to their doom. The air grew colder, the bugle call louder, and the feeling of being watched intensified. They were no longer just observers of history. They were participants in a story that refused to stay buried. And somewhere out there, the Phantom Regiment was waiting. The air crackled with an unseen energy, a lingering echo of the spectral bugle call that had pierced the night. Michael and Jessica stood frozen, their breath clouding in the sudden, inexplicable chill, their eyes darting wildly into the oppressive darkness that now seemed to press in from all sides. The feeling of being watched was no longer a vague apprehension. It was a tangible presence, a multitude of unseen gazes fixed upon them. They were utterly alone, yet surrounded. Jessica, her voice a strained whisper, finally broke the silence. "Michael, did you hear that? See that?" Michael could only nod, his throat tight, his heart hammering against his ribs. "I heard it, and I felt it, like 1,000 eyes on us." He instinctively reached for her hand, their fingers intertwining, a small anchor in the surging tide of their fear. The rational part of their mind screamed for an explanation, for a trick of the light, a sound effect from a distant reenactment, but the sheer visceral terror told a different story. This was real. Whatever it was undeniably real. They didn't speak another word as they scrambled back to their car, the familiar crunch of gravel under their feet doing little to dispel the feeling that something was stalking them from the tree line. Every shadow seemed to coalesce. Every rustle of leaves sounded like approaching footsteps. When they finally reached the safety of the vehicle, Michael fumbled with the keys, his hands shaking so badly, he dropped them once before managing to unlock the doors. The engine roared to life, a comforting sound of modernity, and they sped away from the battlefield, leaving the silent, watchful hills behind. The drive back to their rented cabin was a blur of nervous glances in the rearview mirror and hushed, disbelieving conversation. They tried to rationalize it, to find any logical explanation, but each attempt felt hollow, flimsy. The bugle call, the chill, the overwhelming sense of presence, it defied every scientific principle they knew. By the time they reached the cabin, the sun was just beginning to paint the eastern sky with hues of bruised purple and gray, but the darkness of the night seemed to have seeped into their very bones. Sleep was an impossible dream. Over lukewarm coffee, they recounted every detail, piecing together their individual experiences, confirming each other's sanity. "It wasn't just a sound," Jessica insisted, wrapping her hands around her mug. "It was like a summons, and that feeling like they were looking for something." Michael rubbed his temples. "Looking for what? And why us? We were just there to document the history, not become part of it." But even as he said it, he knew they already were. The history of Gettysburg had reached out and grabbed them, pulling them into its spectral embrace. They spent the entire day consumed by a new kind of research. Their usual historical texts felt inadequate. They needed something more, something that delved into the forgotten corners, the whispers, the local legends. They pored over obscure battlefield accounts, old newspaper archives, and digitized journals from the Civil War era, searching for any mention of strange occurrences, unexplained phenomena, or a regiment that simply vanished or met an unusual end. They focused on the specific area where they had experienced the phenomenon, trying to pinpoint which units were present there on that fateful day. Their search led them down a rabbit hole of forgotten skirmishes and unverified reports. There were countless stories of soldiers lost in the fog of war, units decimated, or individuals simply disappearing. But one particular account, a footnote in a lesser-known regimental history, caught Michael's eye. It spoke of a small, unrecorded skirmish on the western edge of the battlefield, near where they had been, involving a detachment of Union cavalry and a Confederate scouting party. The report mentioned a sudden, blinding fog that rolled in, followed by a cacophony of gunfire and screams, and then silence. When the fog lifted, both sides were gone. No bodies, no prisoners, just abandoned equipment and a lingering smell of sulfur. The official record dismissed it as a localized engagement with heavy losses on both sides. But the tone of the original account hinted at something far more unsettling. "The 17th Pennsylvania Cavalry," Michael read aloud, his finger tracing the faded text on the screen. "A small detachment guarding supply lines. And a Confederate unit, the 4th Georgia Sharpshooters. Both reported missing in action, near what's now known as Orchard Ridge, just a stone's throw from where we were." Jessica leaned closer, her brow furrowed. "But missing? Not killed, not captured? That's unusual, even for Gettysburg." "Exactly," Michael affirmed. The report implies they vanished. And the part about the blinding fog and smell of sulfur, it sounds less like a typical battle and more like something else. The next morning, armed with this tantalizing, disturbing new information, they decided they couldn't just sit in the cabin. They had to go back. Not at night, not yet, but in the harsh light of day, to the very spot where the 17th Pennsylvania and 4th Georgia had supposedly disappeared. They needed to see it with fresh eyes, to look for any physical evidence, anything that might connect the historical anomaly to their terrifying experience. They drove back to Gettysburg, the familiar landscape now imbued with a menacing aura. Every historical marker, every cannon, every stone wall seemed to hold a silent secret. They parked their car near Orchard Ridge, a quiet, less frequented part of the park, and began their trek. The ground was uneven, covered in tall grasses and wildflowers, but the sense of history was palpable. They walked slowly, their eyes scanning the ground, half expecting to find some forgotten relic, a dropped button, a corroded bullet. It was Jessica who found it. Tucked beneath the gnarled roots of an ancient oak tree, partially obscured by moss and fallen leaves, was a small tarnished silver locket. It was heavily oxidized, its surface pitted, but its intricate floral engraving was still visible. Michael carefully pried it open. Inside, 2 faded, sepia-toned photographs. One, a stern-faced young man in a Union uniform, his eyes holding a haunted quality even in the faded image. The other, a woman with soft features and a kind smile. "It's old," Jessica breathed, "Civil War old. And it's Union. Could this be from the 17th Pennsylvania?" As if in answer, a sudden sharp gust of wind swept through the ridge, rustling the leaves of the ancient oak. The air grew noticeably colder, even in the bright morning sun. A faint, almost imperceptible scent of wood smoke and damp earth wafted past them, a smell that had no place in the clean, crisp air. It was fleeting, gone as quickly as it came, but it left a prickle of unease on their skin. They looked at each other, a shared understanding passing between them. This wasn't just a historical artifact, it was a connection, a personal link to the very soldiers whose disappearance had now become their obsession. The locket felt heavy in Michael's palm, not just with age, but with the weight of an untold story, a silent plea echoing across the centuries. They continued their search, their senses heightened, the locket held carefully in Michael's pocket. They found nothing else as significant, but the atmosphere of the ridge had shifted. It felt less like a peaceful historical site and more like a restless grave. As they were about to leave, Jessica spotted a small weathered sign, almost completely overgrown, pointing towards a barely visible narrow path. "Unmarked trail," it read. "Access at your own risk. Private property beyond." Curiosity, or perhaps a growing compulsion, pulled them down the path. It was winding and overgrown, clearly seldom used. After about 10 minutes, the path opened into a small, secluded clearing. In the center stood a dilapidated, single-story cabin, its windows boarded up, its porch sagging. A wisp of smoke curled lazily from its cracked chimney, an impossible sight given its state of disrepair. As they approached, the front door creaked open, revealing a gaunt, elderly man with a long white beard and eyes that seemed to hold the weight of generations. He wore simple, homespun clothes and clutched a gnarled walking stick. He didn't look surprised to see them. In fact, he looked like he'd been expecting them. "Took you long enough," the old man rasped, his voice like dry leaves skittering across stone. He paused, his gaze fixed on Michael's pocket, where the locket rested. "You found it then? Good. Some things, they just don't like to stay buried." Michael and Jessica exchanged a stunned glance. How could this man know about the locket? Who was he? And what did he mean by "some things don't like to stay buried"? The mystery of the Phantom Regiment had just taken an entirely unexpected and deeply personal turn. They had stumbled upon a keeper of secrets, a living link to the very history that refused to die. And the old man's knowing eyes suggested he held answers they desperately needed, answers that might just pull them deeper into the spectral war that still raged in the shadows of Gettysburg. They approached slowly, the crunch of their boots on the gravel path sounding unnaturally loud in the quiet of the late afternoon. The old man, Elias, didn't flinch, didn't even seem to notice them until they were almost upon him, a silent sentinel amidst the ancient stones. He finally turned his head, his gaze piercing, not unkind, but carrying the weight of generations. His eyes, the color of faded denim, seemed to see right through Michael and Jessica, past their weary faces, into the very core of their recent terror. "You've seen them," Elias stated, his voice a low rasp, like dry leaves skittering across granite. It wasn't a question. "The Lost Battalion." Jessica's breath hitched. Michael felt a chill that had nothing to do with the evening air. The name, spoken so casually, so knowingly, confirmed their worst fears and their most desperate hopes. This man wasn't just another tourist or a local eccentric. He was connected. How do you know?" Michael managed, his voice barely above a whisper. Elias offered a faint, weary smile, a network of wrinkles deepening around his mouth. "Because I've seen them too. My father saw them. His father before him. This land. It remembers. And some of us are cursed to remember with it." He gestured to the empty bench beside him. "Sit. You look like you've been running from the devil himself." They sat, the stone cold beneath them, but the warmth of Elias's presence was strangely comforting, a beacon in the storm of their confusion. "They're not just ghosts, are they?" Jessica asked, her voice trembling slightly. "It feels different, more real." Elias nodded, his gaze distant, fixed on the distant tree line where the shadows were lengthening. "No, not just ghosts. Not in the way folks think of them, at least. They're echoes, yes, but echoes trapped in a loop, bound by an oath, a betrayal, and a task unfinished. They are the Lost Battalion, as they call themselves, soldiers who died here, yes, but not in the way history books tell. They were left behind, sacrificed, to cover a retreat, to buy time for a secret to be moved, a secret that should never have seen the light of day." Michael leaned forward, his mind racing. "A secret? What kind of secret?" "It happened during the second day on Little Round Top," Elias began, his voice taking on the cadence of a storyteller, one who had told this tale countless times, not from memory, but from a deeper, inherited knowing. A small regiment, barely 1,000 men, mostly volunteers, was ordered to hold a crucial position. They were told reinforcements were coming. They fought like devils, knowing the fate of the entire Union line rested on their bayonets. But the reinforcements never came. They were sacrificed, abandoned, left to be overrun. Not because a messenger got lost, no. Because a specific, highly sensitive item, entrusted to a high-ranking officer, needed to be smuggled off the field without attracting attention. Their deaths were a diversion, a bloody smokescreen. Jessica gasped. "They were betrayed? To the last man," Elias confirmed, his eyes now holding a profound sadness. "And in their dying breath, as the Confederate tide washed over them, they swore an oath to never rest, never find peace, until the secret they died to protect was brought to light, and the man who sacrificed them was held accountable. But the secret was lost, buried with the officer who carried it, and the betrayer vanished into the annals of history, his name forgotten by all but a handful of families who passed down the truth. So they're searching for this secret?" Michael asked, a new layer of understanding and dread settling upon him. "That's why they march. They are searching for the key to their release," Elias corrected. "The item they died to protect. Some say it's a ledger, detailing a conspiracy far greater than just one battlefield. Others say it's a physical artifact, imbued with a power that could have changed the war's outcome, for good or ill. But whatever it is, it's tied directly to the officer who carried it, and the man who orchestrated their sacrifice. They need to find it, bring it to the light, and expose the truth." "And the man who betrayed them?" Jessica pressed, her voice tight. "Is he still alive? Is that even possible?" Elias shook his head slowly. "No, not in the flesh. But his legacy, his bloodline, his influence, that persists. The Lost Battalion is drawn to it, to those who carry his name or his dark purpose. They are drawn to the injustice, to the echoes of that betrayal in the present day." Michael felt a cold knot tighten in his stomach. "Are you saying this isn't just about history? It's about something happening now?" "The past is never truly past, son," Elias replied, his voice heavy. "Especially not here. The veil between then and now is thin, threadbare in places. And lately it's been tearing. The appearances of the Lost Battalion, they're not just random hauntings. They're growing stronger, more focused. They're converging. Something is stirring, something that has been dormant for a long time. It's almost as if the secret they seek is finally close to being unearthed, or perhaps deliberately reburied by those who don't want it found." "Reburied?" Jessica echoed, a new wave of fear washing over her. "Someone is actively trying to hide it, Even now, the truth, like a persistent weed, always finds a way to sprout, Elias said, his gaze fixed on her, a flicker of warning in his eyes. And there are always those who would rather burn the field than let it grow. My family, the Millers, we've been keepers of this tale, witnesses to the battalion's sorrow for generations. We've seen what happens when the living meddle too deeply, when they draw the attention of the lost. They don't just march. They claim. Claim? Michael asked, a shiver running down his spine. They lost their lives, their names, their honor, and sometimes they try to reclaim it. They try to find a way back, or pull others into their endless march. The apparitions you've seen, the whispers, they are tests. They are invitations. They are warnings. And if you're not careful, they will become your reality. Elias paused, taking a deep, shuddering breath. The officer who carried the secret was named Captain Thomas Sterling, and the man who ordered the sacrifice, the one whose bloodline the Lost Battalion seeks, was General Percival Vance. Vance was a powerful man, well-connected, and he managed to erase almost all traces of his involvement. But I know of one place, a small, forgotten family cemetery on the outskirts of Gettysburg, where the Vance family is buried. An old iron-wrought gate, crumbling stone walls. It's off the beaten path, barely marked on any modern map. My father always said that place held a piece of the puzzle, a whisper of the truth about Vance's legacy. Are you saying we should go there? Jessica asked, her voice barely audible. Elias looked at them, his eyes filled with a profound weariness. I'm not saying you should do anything. I'm saying you're already involved. The Lost Battalion chose you, or you stumbled into their path. Either way, you're marked. The only way out is through. If you want to understand what's happening, if you want to help these poor souls find their peace, then you must seek out the sources of their torment. The Vance Cemetery might hold a clue, a name, a date, something that leads to Captain Sterling's lost cargo. But be warned, the ground there is cold, and the shadows are long. And the Lost Battalion, they will be watching, they will be listening, and they will try to guide you, or perhaps to claim you. He slowly rose from the bench, his movements stiff. I've told you what I know. The rest is up to you. Be careful. The truth often comes with a terrible price, and sometimes the dead demand it in full. He turned, his silhouette stark against the fading light, and began to walk away, his figure growing smaller with each step, until he vanished around a bend in the path, leaving Michael and Jessica alone in the encroaching twilight, the chilling echoes of Elias's words ringing in their ears. Captain Thomas Sterling, General Percival Vance, a lost secret, a family cemetery. The pieces were starting to form a terrifying mosaic, a picture of betrayal and an eternal quest for justice. But the implications, the direct connection to their present, and the chilling warning of being claimed by the Phantom Regiment, left them with a dread far deeper than any they had felt before. The sun had finally dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in hues of bruised purple and angry orange, as if the very battlefield was bleeding. And in the deepening gloom, the distant, mournful strains of a fife seemed to carry on the wind, a spectral melody beckoning them towards a danger they could no longer escape. The fife's melody, ancient and sorrowful, tightened its grip on them, a spectral tendril pulling them deeper into the shadows of Gettysburg. Michael felt an almost physical tug, a strange compulsion that overrode his rational fear. Jessica clutched his arm, her knuckles white, her breath coming in ragged gasps, yet her eyes, wide with terror, were fixed on the direction from which the sound emanated. David, ever the skeptic, found his scientific detachment crumbling under the weight of the inexplicable. He muttered something about acoustic anomalies, but his voice lacked conviction, a tremor betraying his true unease. Emily, the most sensitive, seemed almost to glide, her gaze distant, as if already half lost in the spectral world that was unfolding around them. The air grew heavy, thick with the scent of damp earth and something else, something metallic and old, like forgotten blood on rusted iron. The vibrant colors of the sunset were now swallowed by an encroaching, unnatural gloom, making the familiar landscape twist into grotesque, unfamiliar shapes. Trees became skeletal sentinels, their branches clawing at the bruised sky. Monuments, once stoic markers of history, now loomed like silent, judging specters. The fife grew louder, clearer, no longer a distant whisper but a mournful lament played just beyond their perception, always just out of reach. It was a tune that spoke of loss, of an unbearable longing, a melody that bypassed their ears and settled directly in the deepest, most vulnerable parts of their souls. They pressed on, their footsteps muted by the thickening grass, the only sound their own ragged breathing and the relentless haunting fife. Michael's flashlight beam, a feeble intrusion into the encroaching darkness, danced across the ground, revealing nothing but the tangled roots and decaying leaves of a century and a half. Yet they felt watched. Every rustle of leaves, every snap of a twig, seemed to hold a deliberate intent. The cold, which had been a subtle chill, now intensified, seeping into their bones, an icy touch that felt less like the dropping night temperature and more like the breath of something ancient and unliving. The melody led them towards a forgotten corner of the battlefield, a small overgrown copse of oak trees that seemed to huddle together, their gnarled branches reaching down as if to guard a secret. As they neared, the fife reached a crescendo, a piercing, heart-wrenching note that hung in the air, vibrating with an almost unbearable intensity, before abruptly cutting off. The silence that followed was not just an absence of sound. It was a deafening void, a vacuum that sucked the air from their lungs and left their ears ringing with phantom echoes. "It stopped," Jessica whispered, her voice barely audible, a fragile thread in the oppressive quiet. "Why here?" David asked, his flashlight sweeping frantically, his gaze darting between the shadowy trees. There was a faint shimmering in the air, a distortion just beyond the edge of their vision, like heat rising from asphalt on a summer day, but colder, far colder. Emily gasped, her hand flying to her mouth, her eyes fixed on a specific spot between two ancient oaks. "Look," she breathed, her finger trembling as she pointed. There, nestled amongst the exposed roots of the oldest oak, was a small, tarnished object. Michael stepped forward cautiously, his heart hammering against his ribs. He knelt, his flashlight beam illuminating it. It was a fife button made of silver, but oxidized black with age, its surface etched with intricate scrollwork. What made his blood run cold, however, were the faint, almost indiscernible initials engraved on its back. "Sim." As Michael's fingers brushed against the cold metal, the air around them shimmered violently. The world seemed to tilt, and a wave of nausea washed over them. The scent of gunpowder, sharp and acrid, suddenly filled their nostrils, mingling with the metallic tang of blood. The sounds of distant cannon fire, muffled and dreamlike, rumbled deep in the earth, and the air crackled with the static energy of a brewing storm, or something far older. Then it happened. Not a vision they saw with their eyes, but something that unfolded in their minds, a terrifying, visceral plunge into the past. They were no longer standing in the modern gloom of Gettysburg, but were observers, invisible and helpless, in a moment ripped from history. Before them, not an apparition, but a solid, living man, slumped against the trunk of the very oak tree where Michael had found the button. He was young, impossibly young, perhaps no older than Emily. His uniform, a tattered Union blue, was stained dark with mud and crimson. A crude bandage was wrapped around his head, but blood still seeped through, matting his light brown hair. In his hands, he clutched a silver fife, identical to the one they had seen in the museum. His fingers, thin and pale, moved weakly over the stops, producing the same mournful melody they had followed, but this time it was ragged, punctuated by gasps of pain. His eyes, a startling blue, were wide with a desperate fear, but also a fierce, unyielding determination. He was alone, utterly alone, surrounded by the sounds of a battle that was clearly lost, or at least abandoning him. He played not for an audience but for himself, a final defiant act, a desperate prayer carried on the wind. As the melody faltered, his head lolled, and his gaze drifted upwards, meeting their unseen presence. For a split second, those blue eyes, filled with an ancient sorrow and a chilling awareness, seemed to pierce through the veil of time and see Michael, Jessica, David, and Emily standing there, frozen in terror. A silent plea, a profound accusation passed between them. Then his eyes glazed over. The fife slipped from his grasp, clattering softly against the earth next to him. His last breath left him in a ragged sigh, and his young body went limp. As he faded, a faint, almost imperceptible whisper brushed past them, carrying a single chilling name. Caleb. Caleb Miller. The vision snapped shut as abruptly as it had opened. They were back in the silent, oppressive darkness of the present, the world around them spinning. The scent of gunpowder and blood vanished, replaced by the damp earth. But the cold was more intense now, biting and malevolent. Michael scrambled backward, dropping the fife button as if it had burned him. "Caleb Miller," he breathed, the name echoing in the sudden, profound silence. The Pfeiffer, the one from the diary. Jessica was trembling, tears streaming down her face. He saw us, Michael. He saw us. David, usually composed, looked utterly shattered. His face was pale, his mouth agape. That wasn't a recording. That was real. We were there. Emily, however, had a different reaction. Her eyes, still wide, were now filled with a strange, almost ethereal light. She wasn't just scared. She was deeply, profoundly affected. He was so sad, she whispered, her voice husky. He was calling for something, for someone. As she spoke, the air around them began to crackle again. But this time, it wasn't the distant rumble of cannon. It was a closer, more immediate sound. A low, guttural moan, rising from the very ground beneath their feet. Then a series of soft thuds like boots falling on soft earth, growing rapidly louder, closer. They were no longer alone with the ghost of Caleb Miller. From the trees, the shadows seemed to detach themselves, elongating, coalescing into indistinct, menacing forms. Not just one or two, but dozens, perhaps hundreds. They were still indistinct, like figures seen through a rippling curtain of water, but their purpose was clear. They were advancing. The cold intensified to an unbearable degree, a freezing grip that threatened to paralyze them. A collective gasp escaped them as the forms solidified slightly. They weren't individual soldiers, not yet, but a swirling vortex of spectral energy, a unified, malevolent presence. And at its heart, Michael could almost make out the faint, shimmering outline of a single, unmistakable figure, a Pfeiffer, his silver instrument now glowing with an eerie internal light. It wasn't the mournful, pleading Pfeiffer they had just witnessed. This was something else. This was a conductor, a general leading a regiment of pure, unadulterated dread. "Run!" Michael yelled, his voice cracking, finally breaking the spell of terror that had held them captive. He grabbed Jessica's hand, pulling her back through the trees, David and Emily scrambling behind them. But the battlefield had changed. The path they had taken seemed to have vanished, replaced by an impenetrable wall of darkness. The trees seemed to shift, their branches twisting into thorny barricades. The ground itself felt uneven, disorienting, as if they were running on shifting sand. No matter which way they turned, the spectral presence seemed to be ahead of them, flanking them, hurting them. The thudding footsteps grew louder, faster, now accompanied by the faint, chilling jingle of phantom equipment, the ghostly rustle of tattered uniforms. The air was filled with a chorus of whispers, not individual words, but a cacophony of lost voices, a mournful, angry roar that echoed their own rising panic. They burst out of the copse of trees, only to find themselves not on the open field, but in what appeared to be a shallow, overgrown trench, its edges crumbling and barely discernible. It was a dead end. Above them, the ghostly forms shimmered, now almost fully formed, their faces obscured by shadow, but their intent palpable. The Pfeiffer, standing at the head of the spectral regiment, raised his glowing instrument. And then the fife began to play again. But this was not the mournful lament of Caleb Miller. This was a furious, discordant shriek, a battle cry of pure, unbridled rage and sorrow, designed not to beckon but to trap. The sound pierced their very souls, a physical assault that brought them to their knees, clutching their heads, screaming. The Phantom Regiment, a silent, terrifying wave, began to descend into the trench, their spectral bayonets glinting with an unholy light. They were cornered. They were trapped. And the Phantom Regiment was finally upon them. The air itself seemed to crystallize, each breath a shard of ice in their lungs. The spectral forms, once a distant, terrifying vision, were now upon them, not in a rush of wind or a clash of ethereal steel, but with a silent, suffocating descent. It wasn't a physical impact, not at first. Instead, an unimaginable cold seeped into their bones, a cold that felt less like temperature and more like the absence of all life, all warmth, all hope. It was a spiritual chill that pierced deeper than any winter gust, a cold that threatened to extinguish the very flame of their existence. The spectral bayonets, shimmering with that unholy, internal light, didn't strike their bodies. Instead, they seemed to pass through them, not causing pain in the conventional sense, but a searing, agonizing emptiness. Where the spectral steel intersected their forms, they felt a sudden, horrifying void, as if a piece of their soul had been momentarily ripped away, leaving a gaping, screaming wound in their consciousness. Michael gasped, clutching his chest, a silent cry tearing from his throat, not from a physical blow, but from the profound, crushing despair that flooded every cell. Jessica's eyes were wide, fixed on a phantom soldier whose face, devoid of features, seemed to stare directly into her, pulling at her memories, her identity. She felt a sickening drain, a sensation like being a sieve through which her very essence was pouring out. David, usually grounded by his historical knowledge, was reduced to a primal whimper, his hands pressed against his temples as if trying to hold his mind together. The Phantom Regiment wasn't attacking with steel and lead. They were attacking with pure, concentrated agony of the spirit. They were transferring their own eternal torment, their unfinished business, their unending suffering, directly into the living. Each spectral soldier that passed through them left behind a residue of despair so profound it threatened to shatter their sanity. The trench, once their sanctuary, became a tomb of the living, filled with the ghostly echoes of 100 forgotten deaths, and now their own impending spiritual demise. A spectral officer, taller and more defined than the others, his tattered uniform still bearing the faint, ghostly outline of rank insignia, stopped directly in front of them. Its head, a swirling vortex of shadow and ancient light, tilted as if observing them, judging them. This wasn't a mindless haunting. There was a dreadful intelligence behind these spectral eyes, a purpose steeped in centuries of unresolved pain. The cold intensified, becoming unbearable, threatening to freeze their very blood in their veins. They felt their wills weakening, their resistance crumbling under the sheer weight of the regiment's collective anguish. Jessica, her body trembling uncontrollably, stumbled backward, desperate to escape the immediate presence of the spectral officer. Her foot caught on something loose in the muddy earth of the trench wall. She pitched forward, bracing for impact, but instead, her hand plunged into a soft, yielding section of earth, dislodging a small cascade of dried mud and pebbles. Behind it, not a solid wall, but a small hidden recess, barely large enough for her hand, was revealed. It had been concealed by years of erosion and fallen debris, a secret pocket in the very fabric of the battlefield. As her fingers brushed against something within the recess, a strange phenomenon occurred. The overwhelming cold, the soul-draining despair, momentarily receded. The spectral officer, which had been looming over them, recoiled slightly, its form flickering, its unholy light dimming for an instant. The entire Phantom Regiment seemed to pause, their silent descent arrested, their spectral bayonets no longer glinting with the same malevolent intensity. It was as if whatever Jessica had touched had created a momentary ripple in their spectral reality, a brief respite from their onslaught. "Michael! David!" Jessica whispered, her voice raw with terror and a dawning, fragile hope. "Something in here." Michael, still reeling from the spiritual assault, forced himself to look. David, though still shaking, peered over Jessica's shoulder. She fumbled within the recess, her fingers closing around a small, cold object. Withdrawing her hand, she revealed not a weapon, not a relic of battle, but a small tarnished metal locket, its surface scarred by time and neglect. It was oval-shaped, about the size of her thumb, and its once polished brass had turned a dull verdigris green. Attached to it was a fragment of a delicate, rusted chain. As she held the locket, the strange, localized calm around them solidified. The phantoms, though still present, seemed to hold their ground at the edges of this newfound sphere of quiet. Their ghostly forms still swirled, their silent screams still echoed in the periphery of their minds, but the direct, crushing assault had ceased. It was as if the locket possessed some inherent power, a subtle shield against the regiment's torment. Michael reached out, his hand trembling as he took the locket from Jessica. It was surprisingly heavy for its size. He tried to open it, but the clasp was fused shut by rust and age. "What is it?" he murmured, his voice hoarse. Why did they stop?" David, ever the historian, stared at the locket with newfound intensity, a flicker of his old curiosity returning to his eyes. A locket, a personal item. These things often hold immense sentimental value. Perhaps it belonged to one of them. Perhaps it's tethered to their spirits. Suddenly, the spectral officer, which had been hovering, began to advance again, slowly, deliberately, its unholy light beginning to intensify once more. The temporary calm was breaking. The locket was a temporary reprieve, not a solution. "We need to open it," Jessica urged, her voice laced with renewed urgency. "There has to be something inside." Michael, with a desperate surge of adrenaline, used the sharp edge of a loose rock he found in the trench floor. He carefully, painstakingly worked at the corroded clasp. The metal groaned, protesting, but finally, with a soft, grating click, the locket sprang open. Inside, nestled against the tarnished metal, was a tiny, faded photograph, barely discernible. It depicted a young woman, her face soft and kind, her eyes holding a hint of melancholy. On the opposite side, beneath the photo, was a small, intricately folded piece of paper, so fragile it threatened to crumble at a touch. Michael carefully extracted the paper. It was a single, tightly folded sheet, impossibly preserved despite the decades, perhaps even a century and a half of burial. He unfolded it with the utmost care, his fingers trembling. The script was tiny, elegant, and faded, written in what appeared to be ink that had bled slightly with time. He held it up, squinting in the dim light of the trench, the spectral glow of the phantoms now beginning to encroach upon their small bubble of peace again. The words were difficult to decipher, but one sentence at the very bottom stood out, written in slightly darker, more emphatic strokes. Asterisk, tell Mary. They died for naught. The orders were false. Find the truth by the creek beneath the marked stone. Forgive me, my love. Captain Elias Thorne. Asterisk. Michael read the words aloud, his voice barely a whisper, the implications of the message hitting them like a physical blow. Captain Elias Thorne, David breathed, his eyes wide. That's it. That's the name we saw on the ghostly banner. Elias Thorne was the commander of the 17th Pennsylvania, the regiment that vanished. The moment Michael finished reading, a profound change swept through the trench. The spectral officer, which had been advancing, stopped dead. Its unholy light, which had been intensifying, now began to flicker violently, then soften, shifting from an angry, crimson glow to a mournful pale blue. The entire Phantom Regiment, which had been a terrifying silent wave of despair, now seemed to vibrate with a different kind of energy. Their spectral forms became less menacing, more translucent, as if the weight of their long-held secret had begun to lift. The cold, while still present, eased its crushing grip. The soul-draining sensation receded significantly. The screams in their minds quieted, replaced by a low, mournful hum, like a collective sigh of ancient sorrow. They died for naught, Jessica repeated, her voice filled with a terrible understanding. False orders. They were betrayed. David's face was a mixture of shock and grim realization. This isn't a haunting of malice. It's a haunting of injustice. They're not trying to kill us. They're trying to communicate, to reveal their truth. They've been trapped here, unable to rest, because their sacrifice was in vain, and their honor was stained by a lie. The spectral officer, its form now almost entirely a translucent blue, slowly raised a ghostly hand, not in a gesture of threat, but almost pointing. Its gaze, no longer filled with despair, seemed to fix on Michael and the locket, then out towards the dark, unseen landscape beyond the trench. It was a silent plea, a desperate directive. Find the truth by the creek beneath the marked stone. Michael reread, his voice gaining strength, his fear slowly giving way to a profound sense of responsibility. Mary? Who is Mary? And what creek? What marked stone? The phantoms, though still surrounding them, no longer felt like an immediate threat. They were witnesses, hopeful observers. They had found someone to hear their story, someone to carry their burden. The locket, the faded photograph of a woman named Mary, and the desperate dying words of Captain Elias Thorne were not just relics, they were a sacred trust. They had stumbled into a truth far deeper and more tragic than any ghost story. The Phantom Regiment of Gettysburg wasn't a force of evil, but a legion of the wronged, bound to this earth by an unfulfilled quest for justice. And now Michael, Jessica, and David, three unwitting strangers, held the key to their eternal peace. But unlocking that peace meant stepping further into the heart of a century-old conspiracy, a journey that would lead them beyond the trenches and into the forgotten corners of Gettysburg, where the truth lay buried, waiting to be unearthed. The real danger, they realized, wasn't the phantoms themselves, but the living secrets they had died to protect, and the powerful forces that had sought to bury them forever. They had answered a call, and now they were irrevocably bound to finish what Captain Thorne had started. The silence that followed Michael's declaration was deeper than any they had experienced on the battlefield. It wasn't the quiet of peace, but the heavy, suffocating stillness of a tomb. Jessica sat across from him, her face etched with a mixture of awe and grim determination. Emily, usually the most pragmatic, stared blankly at the wall, processing the enormity of what they had just learned. David, ever the strategist, was already running scenarios in his head, his fingers drumming a silent rhythm on his knee. They were no longer just curious historians or amateur ghost hunters. They were inheritors of a forgotten war, conscripted by the restless spirits of men who had died for a truth too dangerous to be spoken. The weight of that responsibility was immense, a crushing burden that settled deep in their bones. "So what now?" Emily finally asked, her voice a hushed whisper, as if speaking too loudly might alert unseen ears. Michael met her gaze, his own eyes burning with a newfound resolve. "Now we finish it. Thorn found something worth dying for, something worth haunting for. We have to find out what it was, and who the powerful forces are that he spoke of." Jessica nodded slowly. "He mentioned a betrayal, a shadow in the ranks. It wasn't just about a lost battle or a strategic misstep. It was something deeper, something that threatened the very fabric of the Union, perhaps even the future of the country itself." David leaned forward, his analytical mind kicking into gear. "If these forces are still active, still burying this secret, then we're walking into something incredibly dangerous. We need a plan. We need to go back to the beginning, to Thorn's journal. There has to be more." They spent the rest of the night, and the better part of the next day, sequestered in their small motel room, the journal spread open on the table. They meticulously reread every entry, every cryptic phrase, every sketch, seeing them now through the lens of betrayal and conspiracy. The faint scent of aged paper and old ink filled the air, a constant reminder of the past they were unearthing. It was Emily, with her keen eye for detail, who made the breakthrough. While examining a page describing Thorn's growing paranoia and his fear of being watched, she noticed a subtle discoloration in the paper, a slight ripple in the otherwise smooth surface, almost imperceptible to the naked eye. It was near a small hand-drawn compass rose. "Look at this," she murmured, tracing the area with her finger. "It's almost like a watermark, or something pressed into the page." David immediately grabbed his specialized portable scanner, a device he usually used for archaeological mapping. He carefully passed it over the page. On the screen, a faint, almost invisible grid pattern emerged, superimposed over the compass rose. It wasn't a watermark, it was a micro-etching, a secret layer hidden within the paper itself. "It's a cipher," David breathed, his eyes wide with excitement. "A complex one. Looks like a variant of a Vigenère cipher, but with spatial coordinates embedded within the key." Jessica, her historical knowledge proving invaluable, recognized a series of symbols woven into the grid. These aren't just random marks. Some of them are Masonic symbols, others look like forgotten regimental insignias, and a few, they resemble old surveyors' marks from the mid-19th century. Hours blurred into a frenzy of decoding. Michael kept a watchful eye, occasionally offering insights from Thorn's more explicit entries, while Jessica cross-referenced historical maps and regimental records. Emily, with her sharp mind, helped David untangle the intricate mathematical components of the cipher. Slowly, painstakingly, the hidden message began to reveal itself. It wasn't a narrative, but a series of precise coordinates, almost like a scavenger hunt, leading to a specific location on the periphery of the Gettysburg battlefield. But alongside the coordinates were chilling fragments of text: the Iron Hand, the betrayal of the Blue, Profiteers' Pact, and the silent treason. "The Iron Hand," Jessica whispered, her voice barely audible. "I've heard whispers of that in obscure historical texts. A secret society, rumored to have formed during the war, comprised of powerful industrialists and politicians who profited immensely from the conflict, regardless of the outcome. They played both sides, manipulating supplies, information, and even battle outcomes for their own gain." Michael clenched his fists, and Thorn stumbled upon them. He gathered evidence, and they silenced him. And the regiment, they died because of it. The coordinates pointed to an abandoned, dilapidated grist mill, several miles beyond the main battlefield, nestled deep within a forgotten hollow. It was a place not listed on any modern tourist maps, a relic swallowed by time and nature. As they began to pack their gear, a new unsettling feeling crept into the room. It started subtly. Their phones suddenly lost signal, then flickered back on with a strange, distorted hum. The motel room door, which they had triple-locked, creaked open a fraction of an inch, revealing only the dark hallway beyond. David, always alert, noticed a black, unmarked SUV parked conspicuously across the street, its tinted windows reflecting the motel's neon sign like unblinking eyes. It had been there for hours. "We're being watched," he stated, his voice devoid of emotion, but the tension in the room ratcheted up instantly. "They know we're close." A shiver ran down Emily's spine. The powerful forces. They're not just ghosts from the past, are they? They're real and they're here. Michael's jaw tightened. They've been here all along, ensuring Thorne's secret stayed buried. But it ends tonight. We go to that mill. Now, before they can make their move. They moved with a newfound urgency, their fear tempered by a fierce determination. They drove silently through the pre-dawn darkness, the black SUV a persistent shadow in their rearview mirror, never getting too close, never falling too far behind. The air grew heavy, thick with an almost palpable sense of dread and anticipation. As they approached the forgotten hollow, the landscape shifted. The paved road gave way to a winding, overgrown dirt track. Trees, gnarled and ancient, loomed like skeletal guardians. The atmosphere grew cold, despite the lingering summer warmth, and a faint, almost imperceptible mist began to rise from the ground. Then they heard it. Not with their ears but deep within their minds, a faint rhythmic thrumming, like distant drums, accompanied by the ghostly echo of a fife. It was the Phantom Regiment. They were here waiting, guiding them. The mill appeared out of the gloom, a skeletal silhouette against the paling sky. Its wooden walls were rotten, its roof collapsed in places, and its windows stared out like vacant eyes. It exuded an aura of profound desolation, a place where time had not merely passed but had died. They parked their car a distance away, plunging into the dense undergrowth to approach the mill stealthily. The drumming intensified, a frantic cadence now, urging them forward, yet also warning them. Inside the mill, dust motes danced in the slivers of moonlight filtering through the gaps in the walls. The air was thick with the scent of decay and damp earth. David deployed his drone, its tiny camera sweeping the interior, searching for anomalies. Emily used a portable ground-penetrating radar, scanning the floorboards and the crumbling stone foundations. After what felt like an eternity, Emily's device emitted a faint, consistent signal. "Here," she whispered, pointing to a section of the old stone foundation, partially obscured by rubble and overgrown vines. "There's a void, something hidden behind this wall." Working carefully, using tools they had brought, they began to dismantle the ancient stones. The work was slow, arduous, and every creak of the old mill, every rustle of leaves outside, sent a jolt of fear through them. The phantom drumming was now a frantic crescendo, almost deafening in their minds. Finally, they dislodged a large, flat stone, revealing a dark, shallow cavity behind it. Inside, nestled beneath layers of preserved canvas and wrapped in oilskin, was a small, ornate wooden strongbox. Its exterior was weathered, but the craftsmanship was exquisite. Michael carefully pulled it out. The weight of it was surprising, heavy with the secrets it contained. With trembling hands, he unlatched the brass clasp. Inside, nestled on a bed of faded velvet, was not the final damning evidence, but something equally significant. A small leather-bound ledger, its pages filled with elegant, coded script, and a single intricately engraved brass key. The ledger's cover bore a single embossed symbol, a stylized iron hand. Jessica gasped, her eyes fixed on the ledger. The iron hand! This is it. Thorne's record of their activities. They quickly flipped through the pages. The coded entries were dense, baffling at first glance, but a few key phrases repeated throughout stood out: Fortress North, the Vault of Whispers, and Sentinel's Gate. David quickly photographed every page, uploading them to his secure server for later decryption. But even without fully decoding, the sheer volume of meticulous entries, the dates, the cryptic names, pointed to a vast generation-spanning conspiracy. The brass key, too, held a clue. Etched into its shaft was a single word: Everwatch. Everwatch, Emily repeated, a sudden understanding dawning on her face. There's an old private historical society in Philadelphia. It's called the Everwatch Society. They have one of the most secure private archives in the country. Rumor has it they hold documents that even the Library of Congress can't access. Michael's eyes widened. The final evidence. It's not here. It's in the vault of the Everwatch Society. Thorne must have left this ledger as a map to something far greater, something he knew he couldn't protect here. But their moment of revelation was shattered by the sudden, undeniable sound of approaching vehicles. Headlights cut through the trees, illuminating the hollow. The drone David had sent to scout ahead briefly showed several black SUVs, identical to the one that had shadowed them, converging on the mill. The drumming in their minds abruptly ceased, replaced by a chilling silence. They were trapped. The strongbox with Thorne's ledger and the Everwatch key lay open before them, a beacon in the darkness. The powerful forces had found them, and they were closing in. The oppressive silence that followed the cessation of the psychic assault was worse than any scream. It pressed down on them, stealing the air from their lungs, the warmth from their bodies. Michael instinctively pulled Jessica closer, his arm a desperate anchor in the sudden, crushing cold. David fumbled, his flashlight beam now a pathetic, flickering beacon against the encroaching gloom. Emily, her eyes wide with a terror more profound than anything they had yet faced, gripped the strap of her bag, scanning the deepening shadows. The strongbox lay open, the heavy, leather-bound ledger and the intricate Everwatch key glinting mockingly in the weak light. They were exposed, vulnerable. A low, guttural murmur began to ripple through the air, not from any single direction, but from everywhere at once. It was a sound like dry leaves skittering across barren earth, mingled with the distant, mournful wail of a bugle. The temperature plummeted further, the air growing thick with the scent of damp soil, gunpowder, and something else. Something ancient and metallic like dried blood. Then they saw them. Not fully formed at first, but as distortions in the very fabric of the darkness. Shimmering, translucent outlines began to coalesce from the walls, from the floor, from the very air around them. Figures tall and gaunt, clad in the tattered spectral uniforms of both Union and Confederate soldiers. They weren't fighting each other. Their hollow, ancient eyes, like pinpricks of dying embers, were fixed on the group, and more specifically on the strongbox, the ledger, and the key. Michael shoved Jessica behind him, his heart hammering against his ribs. "What are they?" he whispered, his voice barely audible above the rising, unearthly murmur. Jessica, pale and trembling, could only shake her head. "The Phantom Regiment," she breathed, the words a terrified confirmation of their worst fears. "They're real." The spectral soldiers moved with an eerie, silent grace. They weren't walking, they were gliding, their forms flickering like old film. They passed through the stone pillars of the chamber, through each other, their numbers growing exponentially, until the small space was teeming with an army of the dead. The whispers intensified, resolving into fragmented, overlapping voices. Commands from long-dead officers, cries of pain, the chilling clatter of phantom muskets. David, his hands shaking, tried to raise his camera, but it felt impossibly heavy, useless. "We need to get out of here," he cried, his voice cracking. He lunged towards the opening they had used to enter, but a wall of shimmering blue and gray forms solidified directly in his path. The cold emanating from them was absolute, a physical force that pushed him back, stealing his breath. Emily, ever the pragmatist, frantically scanned the chamber. "There's no way out. They're surrounding us." One figure, taller and more defined than the others, began to emerge from the spectral throng. He wore the uniform of a Union general, his face gaunt, his eyes burning with an intense, ancient fury. He pointed a translucent, skeletal finger directly at the strongbox. "They want this," Michael realized, his gaze darting from the general to the ledger and key. "They're not just here to scare us. They're protecting something." Jessica, despite her terror, felt a flicker of academic curiosity ignite within her. "The Everwatch key," she murmured. Thorne was obsessed with it. What if it's not just a key to something but a key for them? Or for what they guard? The general's spectral form drew closer, his silent accusation palpable. The air grew so cold that ice crystals began to form on their exposed skin. Their teeth chattered uncontrollably. "The ledger!" Emily cried, her eyes wide. "Thorne's notes. He must have written something about them, about the key." Michael snatched the heavy book from the strongbox, his fingers stiff with cold. He flipped through the pages frantically, the leather creaking ominously. The handwriting was Thorne's, precise and obsessive, but now it seemed to swim before his eyes. He passed it to Jessica, whose historical expertise might offer a quicker understanding. Jessica's trembling fingers traced the elegant script. She skimmed past Thorne's initial theories about dimensional rifts and temporal anomalies, past his increasingly frantic entries about the Gettysburg anomaly. Her eyes darted across the pages until she found a section marked with a crude, hand-drawn symbol. A stylized eye within a compass rose. "Here," she gasped, her voice hoarse. "He calls them the Guardians of the Veil." He believed they were bound to this place, not by death, but by an ancient pact, an oath sworn to protect something hidden beneath the battlefield. The spectral general was almost upon them now, his form radiating an unbearable cold. The other phantoms pressed in, their silent, accusing faces mere inches from their own. Michael felt a profound sense of despair, a chilling certainty that their time was running out. What are they protecting? Michael demanded, his voice strained. Jessica read faster, her eyes darting across the page. He believed they were guarding a nexus of temporal energy, a place where the fabric of time and space was thin. He called it the Chronos Well. And the Everwatch Key. She looked up, her eyes meeting Michael's, a desperate revelation dawning on her face. The Everwatch Key isn't for a lock, Michael. It's a regulator, a control for the Chronos Well. It maintains the balance. It keeps the veil intact. The general raised his spectral hand, and the murmuring of the regiment swelled into an unbearable crescendo, a symphony of ancient suffering and furious indignation. They were about to be overwhelmed. Thorn thought he could manipulate it, Jessica continued, her voice rising in urgency. He thought he could use the Chronos Well to glimpse the future, to rewrite history, to gain ultimate knowledge. He was trying to disable the Everwatch Key, to open the veil completely. The words hung in the frigid air, a horrifying realization. Thorn wasn't just a treasure hunter. He was a madman, attempting to unravel the very fabric of reality. And the Phantom Regiment, these tormented souls, were not malevolent spirits, but desperate guardians, bound by an ancient oath to prevent such a catastrophe. Emily, ever observant, pointed to a faint engraving on the floor of the chamber, just beneath where the strongbox had been. It was the same stylized eye within a compass rose that marked the ledger. In the center of the engraving was a small circular indentation. The key, it goes there, Emily shouted, her voice cutting through the spectral din. Michael looked at the Everwatch Key in his hand. It was not a conventional key with teeth, but a smooth, intricate brass disc, perfectly circular, with an eye motif etched into its center. It was a perfect match for the indentation on the floor. The Phantom General was now directly in front of them, his breath, if he had any, chilling them to the bone. They could feel the immense, ancient power radiating from him, a force that threatened to tear them apart atom by atom. The other phantoms were pressing in, their forms overlapping, their whispers becoming a deafening roar. The key, Michael. Put it in, Jessica urged, pointing to the indentation. It's the only way to restore the balance, to calm them. With trembling hands, Michael knelt, the Everwatch Key heavy and cold in his grasp. The Phantom General's spectral hand was reaching for him, so close he could feel the absolute zero of its touch. The cries of the regiment were a cacophony in his ears, a symphony of warning and despair. He pressed the key into the indentation. It slid in with a soft, almost imperceptible click, settling perfectly into place. For a moment nothing happened. The general's hand continued its slow, inexorable descent. The phantoms roared. Then a soft, ethereal light began to emanate from the key, pulsing gently, growing brighter with each beat. The light was not harsh but warm, a soothing golden hue that spread across the floor, up the walls, engulfing the entire chamber. As the light intensified, the spectral forms of the regiment began to waver. Their roars softened, transforming into something like sighs of relief. The cold began to recede, replaced by a strange, almost comforting warmth. The general's hand, which had been reaching for Michael, slowly lowered, his hollow eyes seeming to soften, to lose their furious intensity. The light pulsed again, brighter still, and the entire chamber hummed with a deep, resonant vibration that they felt in their bones. The phantoms, bathed in the golden glow, began to fade, not with a sudden disappearance, but with a slow, dignified retreat, their forms growing more transparent, more ethereal, until they were mere shimmers in the light. The general was the last to fade, his gaze lingering on the group for a moment, a look of profound gratitude or perhaps solemn warning in his ancient eyes. Then with a final gentle pulse, the golden light receded, pulling back into the Everwatch Key. The key itself pulsed once more, then settled, glowing with a faint, steady luminescence. The chamber was quiet again, the air no longer frigid but merely cool. The oppressive silence was gone, replaced by the soft, steady hum emanating from the key. They stared at the glowing Everwatch Key, embedded in the stone floor. The strongbox lay open, Thorn's ledger still clutched in Jessica's hand. They had faced the Phantom Regiment of Gettysburg, and by some miracle, they had survived. They had understood Thorne's true, dangerous ambition, and they had, perhaps, saved untold realities in the process. But as they caught their breath, their eyes fell upon a new detail that the fading light of the key revealed. Beneath the Everwatch key, now fully visible in the stone, was another smaller indentation. It was not for a key, but for a small metallic cylinder. And within Thorne's ledger, still open in Jessica's hands, was a final, hastily scrawled entry, almost illegible, detailing something called the Chronos Seed. They had activated the Everwatch, restoring the balance. But what was the Chronos Seed? And what would happen if that was activated? The true depth of Thorne's plan, and the ultimate danger, was only just beginning to reveal itself. The Chronos Seed. Thorne's voice, now devoid of its previous bluster, held a chilling, almost reverent quality as he spoke the words. The Everwatch was merely the key, a necessary conduit to stabilize the temporal energies of this place. But the Chronos Seed, that is the sculptor's chisel. It doesn't merely show the past, Michael. It rewrites it. A cold dread seeped into Michael's bones, far deeper than any fear he'd felt before. Jessica gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. David's jaw tightened, and Emily's eyes widened in horror. "You don't understand," Thorne continued, a manic gleam entering his eyes as he gestured towards a complex, almost organic-looking device nestled within the Everwatch's core. It hummed with a low, resonant thrum, a sound that seemed to vibrate not just in the air, but in their very bones. It was a sphere of polished obsidian, veined with intricate, glowing silver lines that pulsed like a slow, dark heartbeat. "This nation, this world is fractured, divided. I see the fault lines, the irreparable damage that began here on this very ground. The Everwatch shows me the inevitable decay, the slow unraveling of everything we hold dear." He stepped closer to the Chronos Seed, his hands hovering over its surface as if in prayer. "But what if we could mend it? Not with bandages, but by severing the wound at its source? What if the Union had never prevailed here? What if the trajectory of this nation had been altered, steered onto a different, more unified path, free from the bitter divisions that fester even today? The Chronos Seed allows me to plant a singular, precise alteration, a ripple in time that will spread, reshaping the present into the future it should have been." The true horror of his plan crystallized in their minds. He wasn't just observing. He was attempting an act of temporal terrorism on a cosmic scale. The Phantom Regiment, the shimmering echoes of history, were merely symptoms of the timeline's inherent instability. Thorne wasn't trying to resolve it, he was trying to exploit it. "You'll destroy everything," Emily cried, her voice trembling. "You can't just rewrite history. The consequences would be catastrophic, unpredictable." "Unpredictable," Thorne scoffed, turning to face them, his expression a mask of chilling certainty. "Or simply different. And who are you to judge what is catastrophic? I have seen the future, the one that awaits us if we do nothing. I am merely providing a necessary course correction." He pressed a series of symbols on a small console embedded in the Everwatch, near the Chronos Seed. The obsidian sphere began to glow brighter, the silver veins pulsing with increasing intensity, mirroring the frantic beat of Michael's own heart. The air around them began to crackle, not with static, but with something far more profound. The ancient stones of the Everwatch chamber seemed to shimmer, their solid forms wavering at the edges. Outside, through the cracks in the ancient walls, they could see the battlefield of Gettysburg distorted, twisting, the familiar outlines of trees and hills blurred, replaced by fleeting glimpses of a different reality. Cannons, no longer ghostly echoes, seemed to materialize and then vanish, their spectral roar momentarily deafening. The phantom soldiers, previously ethereal, now appeared almost solid, their forms flickering like a faulty projection, but with a terrifying sense of presence. Their faces, once indistinct, now held expressions of raw, guttural agony, fear and battle fury. "He's activating it," Jessica yelled, her fingers flying across her own tablet, desperately trying to find a way to interface with Thorne's systems. "I can't get a lock. His encryption is layered over the Everwatch protocols. We have to stop him now," David roared, charging forward. But Thorne, anticipating the move, had already activated a defensive energy field that shimmered into existence around the Chronos Seed, pushing David back with an unseen force. "Foolish mortals," Thorne sneered, his gaze fixed on the glowing orb. You cannot comprehend the power I am about to unleash. A new dawn for America, forged from the crucible of a revised past. The chrono seed pulsed violently, and the air filled with a high-pitched whine that resonated deep within their skulls. The distortions outside intensified. The ground beneath their feet began to tremble, and dust rained down from the ancient ceiling. Michael felt a searing pain in his head, 1,000 conflicting memories rushing through him, glimpses of a reality that was and a reality that might be. He saw the Union lines breaking, the Confederate charge succeeding, a different flag waving over a different nation. He saw himself in these fractured realities, sometimes existing, sometimes not, a terrifying echo of his own being. Emily, ever observant, pointed. "Look, the Phantom Regiment. They're solidifying." Indeed, the spectral soldiers outside were no longer mere apparitions. They were taking on form, their ragged uniforms, their rusted muskets, their pained expressions becoming terrifyingly real. They weren't just echoes anymore. They were becoming anchored to this moment, ripped from their original timeline and forced into a new unstable reality. They were screaming, a chorus of timeless agony, caught between worlds. "He's not just changing history," Michael gasped, clutching his head, the pain almost unbearable. "He's tearing the fabric of reality itself. They're not just phantoms anymore. They're fragments of a shattered timeline." Jessica, her eyes fixed on her tablet, finally made a breakthrough. "I've found a backdoor. The Everwatch's energy signature is fluctuating wildly, but it's still trying to maintain temporal integrity. If I can reroute some of its core power, I might be able to overload the chronoseed's primary temporal modulator. But it's risky. It could destabilize the Everwatch itself, or worse, create a paradox feedback loop that erases us all." "Do it, Jessica," Michael yelled, ignoring the throbbing in his head. "We have no other choice." David, seeing Thorne momentarily distracted by Jessica's frantic hacking, seized his chance. He lunged again, not at the energy field but at the console Thorne was manipulating. With a guttural roar, he threw his entire weight against the ancient stone, causing it to crack. The energy field flickered for a split second. That was all they needed. Emily, with surprising agility, darted past the flickering field, grabbing a heavy, ornate brass lever on the side of the chrono seed that Thorne had overlooked in his haste. It was clearly an emergency disengagement mechanism. She pulled it with all her might. A grinding metallic shriek filled the chamber. Thorne, startled, turned with a furious snarl. "No!" At that precise moment, Jessica's reroute took effect. A blinding flash of blue energy erupted from the Everwatch's core, arcing towards the Chronos seed. The obsidian sphere vibrated violently, its silver veins glowing with an unbearable intensity. It whined, screamed, and then imploded, not with a bang, but with a horrifying silent implosion of light and air, sucking all sound and energy into its vanishing point. The energy field around Thorne collapsed. The distortions outside the chamber vanished instantly, as if a switch had been flipped. The Phantom Regiment, which had been on the verge of becoming fully real, dissolved back into shimmering echoes, their pained cries fading into the background hum of the restored timeline. The ground stopped trembling. The air cleared, leaving behind only the scent of dust and ozone. Thorne stood frozen, his eyes wide with disbelief, staring at the empty space where his chronos seed had been. The manic gleam in his eyes was replaced by a hollow, defeated despair. What have you done?" he whispered, his voice broken. Michael, leaning against a crumbling pillar, his head still throbbing but the searing pain subsiding, looked at Thorne with a mixture of pity and resolve. "We saved it. We saved all of it. You tried to play God, Thorne. You tried to rewrite history, and in doing so you nearly destroyed reality itself." The Everwatch, now stabilized, hummed with a soft, steady rhythm, its ancient mechanisms working in harmony. The temporal energies, once chaotic, were now balanced, flowing smoothly. The Phantom Regiment, though still present, was once again merely an echo, a memory shimmering at the edges of perception, no longer threatening to tear the world apart. Emily, catching her breath, looked at the others. "It's over. The chrono seed is gone. The timeline, it's stable again." David, bruised but victorious, apprehended a stunned Thorne, securing him with a set of modern restraints he'd kept in his pack, a stark contrast to the ancient power Thorne had sought. "He's not going anywhere." As the first rays of dawn pierced through the cracks in the Everwatch chamber, casting long shadows across the ancient stones, Michael felt a profound sense of exhaustion, but also an unexpected peace. The Phantom Regiment of Gettysburg, the catalyst for this entire harrowing journey, still flickered outside. But now they were different. They were not a threat, but a testament. A testament to the sacrifices made, to the history forged, to the fragile, precious balance of time itself. They had faced the impossible, stared into the abyss of temporal chaos, and pulled reality back from the brink. The world outside remained oblivious to the battle fought within these hidden walls, to the fate of all humanity that had hung in the balance. But for Michael, Jessica, David, and Emily, nothing would ever be the same. They had seen the ghosts of history, not just as stories, but as living, breathing echoes, and understood the immense weight of every single moment, every choice, every battle fought and won or lost. The Everwatch stood as a silent guardian, its purpose now fully realized. And as they emerged from the ancient chamber, blinking in the early morning light of a world they had saved, the Phantom Regiment of Gettysburg seemed to salute them, a silent, eternal reminder of the past, forever intertwined with the present, forever watched over by those who understood its true, profound significance. The echoes of history would always be there, a whisper in the wind, a shimmer on the horizon, but now they were no longer a threat. They were a promise that some stories, some moments, some sacrifices are meant to stand the test of time, unaltered, revered, and eternally remembered.